we're waiting on? Are we waiting?
You are ready to get started.
Okay. Carolyn, it sounds like we are going to wait on Taro.
Okay. I will pause it.
All right, I'll throw you back up.
Okay. I will pause the recording until Taro gets there.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
I just started the recording. You're ready to go.
Carolyn has just started the recording.
All right.
Whenever
Great.
you'd like to go live.
I'm calling the September 19th, 2022 meeting of the Albemarle County Architecture Review Board to order. It's 1:04. Carolyn, could you call the roll, please?
Sure. Mr. Stoner,
Here.
Mr. Hancock,
Here.
Mr. Matsuno,
Here.
Mr. Henningsen,
Here.
Mr. Vanderwerf.
Here.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Today's meeting is a hybrid meeting. The public may access and participate in the meeting electronically. Instructions for doing so are posted on the Albemarle County website at the Albemarle County calendar. The public has real-time audiovisual access to this meeting over Zoom and real-time audio access over telephone, both as provided in the lawfully posted meeting notice. This meeting is being recorded and will be made available on the county's website. This meeting is a public record and subject to disclosure under the Freedom of Information Act. All speakers, when it's your turn to speak, please first state your name for the record. Applicants who are making presentations, note that your presentation is limited to a total of 15 minutes, which you can divide among your team members. Carolyn will let us know when the 15 minutes are up. If applicants in the meeting room have team members attending virtually who will need to present, please make that known when you come to the podium. Everyone who is participating virtually, please mute your microphone until it is your turn to speak. Do any ARB members have anything to disclose? No. Nope.
No.
All right. Carolyn, are there any members of the public that want to make a comment about a project that is not on the agenda for review?
I do not have anybody on Zoom besides me. So no.
That's great. There are no consent agenda items today or regular review items. There is one work session today. It's on the entrance card or design guidelines addenda. Mariah, are you ready with the presentation?
Yes,
Thanks.
great. Let's start. So today we're going to talk about, or we have for you Route 240 and Fontaine Extended. You've seen, so two corridors, you've seen this one in parts of, a portion of these segments so far, but I just wanted to go through those again and show you, we had this corridor sheet before, but we hadn't had all of the segments broken out. So just to show you it with all of the segments broken out, and then revisiting the first couple of segments because we've changed the maps on them. So we, instead of having two very finite endpoints, graphically communicated with circles and a thick red line, we've changed those to thinner arrows that allows a little more context to show through in terms of the street's relationship with the neighboring properties. And it also communicates a certain level of flexibility, permeability, and transition between segments. So it's not a finite boundary anymore. So Licking Hole Creek for you again, as well as Three Notched Residential. So being the first two on the eastern side of the segment. And then going through this segment again, we have Crozet Industrial between Union Mission Lane to the west and Parkwood Ridge Drive to the east. And I guess I should stop here and say, would you like me to go through all of the segments pretty quickly and then we can go back and focus on each one? Would that be helpful? Or would you rather take each of the segments in turn and then move to the next one?
Sounds like if we go through all of them, if anyone has a comment.
And then we can
go
circle back.
Yeah.
So Crozet Industrial, that includes Star Hill Brewery, and then Railway, which is just the residential portion that has the railway on the southern side and residential on the northern side that stretches from Union Mission Lane to Firehouse Lane. And then downtown Crozet is a spread. So we see both sheets here as they would lay out in a printed book fashion. I also have each of these on a single sheet on a single slide if we need to kind of blow it up a little bit so you can read it. But this goes from Firehouse Lane to the east to Tabor Street. It rounds the corner of Crozet Avenue and goes down to the intersection of Tabor Street to the south. And then what we called rolling residential, which is between Tabor Street and and the vicinity of Davis Lane to the south. And then the vicinity of Davis Lane to the intersection of Route 250 south, and that's the end of the Route 240 corridor. Excuse me. So going back to the segments you've not seen, the first one would be Crozet Industrial. So do you have any comments on this segment?
Guess we'll just go through, Frank Stoner, do you have any comments?
I don't think I do, no.
Dade,
No, I don't.
Frank Hancock?
Just one quick question. Is there a recent, or maybe not recent, last 10 years or so project in this segment that's been under review? I might be mixing this up with another segment.
I think we looked at one for like a veterinary clinic or something and near this, maybe not in it, but I
Oh.
don't know that it's been built yet.
Just curious if I mean, it's always helpful to include something that's been through review. And I didn't know if there was something in this segment. I might be mixing that up.
We can double check.
Okay.
Tara, do you have any questions or comments?
I think I guess I was wondering. I mean, maybe I think it makes sense the division of this segment into the this one and the railroad segment. But I kind of wanted to maybe revisit that question to make sure I was understanding. I mean, I think that there's like a distinct change in context from those moments, but it is like a very short segment as a part of this overall corridor. So.
It is. That segment is 0.3 miles. So it's perceptionally, it almost acts as this kind of gateway between two built areas. It's zoned for residential use. That's not to say that it will always be zoned for residential use, but right now it is. And there's some pretty buildings along that area. But actually, now that I think about it, the Crozet Industrial did have one building that's gone up in the past, well, since COVID in the past 2 years, and that was a car wash. In the third picture at the bottom, it is in that a graded area is now a car wash. But it's set back pretty far from the road. It was supposed to be a last phase to a phased development, but they decided to do it first.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. I don't have any comments either.
I'll go to the next one. And we can always go back and talk about the relationship between all of them. However, if you all want to give comments in any order, that's fine.
Sure. So I appreciate, I think it does make sense to keep this separate just because of how different the context of use and landscape is. One question I had in terms of the characteristics to avoid was on landscaped lawns, because I guess the central photo at the bottom talks about the front lawns giving a pedestrian scale. And I wasn't sure if that's actually a condition that we're discouraging or encouraging. And if by unlandscaped, we mean without corridor trees and plantings, or just clarifying what that means.
Oh, I'm sorry. Was that a question or is that a
Well, just
comment?
a comment, maybe just to clarify, when we say unlandscaped, whether, what portion of landscape we're saying is missing. And related to that, assuming that maybe the lawns without trees are not, are the unlandscaped lawns that we're trying to avoid, just clarifying in that photo.
I think we can clarify that.
Okay, I'll move on to downtown Crozet.
We go in order or just want to
guess-
speak up?
Yeah,
if you
I don't
like?
have any comments on this one.
I don't have any comments either.
I think this is a pretty important section just because of the diverse architectural styles and just collection of buildings here. I think there's a lot to draw on. The one thing I would maybe point out or bring up for discussion is how we think about the tower building. The senior, I can't remember what the
Mhm.
name of that building is. You know, one question is like, is any of the zoning around it would allow for anything even to be that tall? Or and then if, you know, if an applicant were to point to that, you know, how do we address that? How do we think about that building? Because that predates the EC, is that correct? Yeah. But it just looms so large over Crozet.
It may be possible just to emphasize the historic resource aspect of it rather than
Yeah.
Okay,
than a scale that should be continued.
okay.
That's a great point, Frank.
And then I will note, I think it's a really nice mural. I know murals aren't really in our purview, but if we're looking for a successful mural, I think that is one.
I think it does help to, oh, I'm sorry, this is not my time to speak. Sorry.
Do you have a comment?
You have the floor anytime.
Yeah.
I think it helps to soften that edge by having the mural, especially with the distant view beyond it, coming from south to north. There's a view of the mountains in the background, and I think it helps to blend nicely between the kind of ivory buff or the very light color and then the mountain views to the side. And it gives almost a sense of destination, like a viewpoint that is more central to the development. So I think it's kind of almost a nice landmark area. The way that they've done the mural, I think, is successful in that way.
I agree.
Would it be worth then including that in some of the images, both to address its non-entrance corridor or predating the entrance corridor and calling out the mural?
Do you think it'd be too heavy-handed by calling out a building that is not in conformity?
Well, I know that we've done it previously. I guess that's a question for us to discuss. If it makes sense to include it or if it makes sense to just leave the images as is.
Yeah. I mean, we do have zoning as one of the sections we use on some of these sheets. I don't know if it's on this one.
They're not typically included on
Zoning in the
segments.
area or, you know, only allows X. And that would maybe answer that question without being specific to that building.
I think that makes sense.
So by way of disclosure, which I probably should have up front, I am involved in the redevelopment of the Barnes lumber site, which is a good portion of the 3-notched and 240 Crozet Avenue review district. One of the things we've been wrestling with is the fact that essentially Main Street, there will be a new Main Street. So 240 is more like an access road. And so the buildings that are on Main Street, which will be south of the railroad tracks, will actually back up to the railroad tracks. So the rears of those buildings will be visible from 240. And struggling to figure out how do we just, you know, that's a very different condition than Crozet Avenue, where you're kind of in the downtown district. And I understand why these two are unified into kind of a downtown district because the zoning supports it around it. But I think I'd love to just get some thoughts from you all because we're in the process of working with Margaret Mariah to develop the updated architectural guidelines for the Barnes property, trying to make those sort of interface or connect to the county's ARB guidelines for this corridor. And so we don't want to build buildings that have two fronts because that seems sort of duplicitous, expensive, contrived, et cetera. But there is some need for treatment on the back. And I don't know whether that's landscaping or, some combination of landscaping and architecture, but I would
Just to
ask you guys for
the
constructive.
the
feedback.
backs of these buildings would be across the tracks.
Correct. Yeah.
To me, it seems.
Unfortunately, there's
yeah.
not a lot of space between the tracks. It's pretty tight. So there's not like a room for a large landscape buffer back there that you could. plant
Yeah.
up.
Seems analogous to like 64, for example, like, the Wegmans building. The back of the building faces 64 and it certainly can't be confused with the front of that building, but it did receive, at least a certain amount of treatment to, make it presentable from the corridor. And it seems like as long as minimum standards were maintained to just keep the rears of those buildings, presentable, that seems like it would be a similar situation to me.
In light of this, do we want to look at maybe breaking this into two segments? Would that maybe help provide distinction if we think about, it ending at the four-way stop?
Unfortunately, I think the right side, the north side of Three Notch could be redeveloped in a way that's similar to Crozet Avenue in
Mhm.
theory. Although I don't get the impression that's gonna happen anytime soon, but
Well, I guess this kind of goes back to my question about the railroad segment, because I think you could potentially make an argument that this north segment of Three Notch could extend to the edge of the industrial zone.
Mhm.
Because even though there are a collection of sort of downtown-y structures in this portion of the downtown, what's currently the downtown Crozet district. I mean, if you leave just one building over, it does assume a pretty similar, residential character. And so if we extended this segment over to the railroad overpass essentially, and think of that as the threshold to the next segment of the downtown district, then it would maybe let us treat everything north of the railroad as having a particular character and relationship to the stuff on the other side of the railroad. Because, I understand the problem with this. I hear the problem that you have with this property, and in my mind, at least, experiencing the drive up, I don't think of the stuff on the other side of the railroad tracks as having the same relationship to like the entrance corridor that the stuff that you pass as you're going down under the railroad overpass and seeing the rest of downtown Crozet. That could be one way to solve it.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And I think the dominant element is the railroad track.
Yeah.
It would be throughout that segment.
I mean, in my mind, if the facades of whatever is apparent from the other side of the railroad tracks were in an appropriate material, in terms of like the detailing and all that kind of stuff, I don't see that that's as much of a concern, like Chris had mentioned with the Wegmans.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing from the Wegmans is, I guess mainly it's in VDOT's right of way, but there is a little bit of a planting buffer. It's not as deep as I think some of us would desire, but I think to the extent the railroad is an edge, if there were a reinforcement of that with landscape that was consistent, I think that would be desirable, though I also hear you saying, Frank, that there's maybe a challenge in the available site area for planting.
yeah, it's just dimensional challenges because you don't. You gotta get parking back there and then the building gotta fit, to get a block structure on the rest of the property, you're just constantly
Right, yeah.
pushing toward the tracks. Yeah.
I think we talked about this a couple of years back. Maybe we were looking at design guidelines or something. And
Yeah.
one of the things we talked about that stuck with me is there's an opportunity here to like provide glimpses into what's kind of beyond those buildings, and then having those backs up against the corridor adds to the feeling of like, oh, this is a town, it's more dense. And then perhaps, giving those glimpses in, that's kind of your frontage on the corridor is like, hey, there's a town beyond there, or there's activity beyond these buildings, and not necessarily, a fake front door that you never see anybody go in and out of,
Right.
Yeah.
So
So if there's a way like at mid-block, or the architecture set up so that you get those glimpses in, and then that is maybe what's kind of impacting the corridor.
But I think I like Tara's suggestion of sort of combining the north of the railroad track segments and then south of the intersection. And that obviously they're different characters in terms of use, in terms of what's north of the railroad, but that makes some sense.
Yeah, I also like that suggestion because as was said, the tracks themselves seem dominant throughout that whole, at least that side of the road. So there's a certain consistency there until you go under that underpass.
If there were to be a development in the future that is in that more commercial portion of downtown, or the segment that Frank Stoner, you were saying, would the backs of those buildings be evaluated from the railway segment, and then the fronts of them be evaluated against the downtown Crozet segment? How would that be evaluated?
good question.
That is a good question.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know that ironically, I'm not sure that the fronts of those buildings are actually visible from any corridors. Although I guess if you had the glimpse, what are we, 500, 900 feet? What's the,
500, I think is the.
I think the way those parcels lay out, though, it's the entire, that whole area. So it's
The
just ends
entire
up being
thing.
whatever's
Okay.
visible from either street.
yeah, so in that case, right, I think it would have to be the downtown would apply to the fronts of to the other side, and the railroad would apply to which kind of makes sense. Yeah.
Are you okay with that?
Am I
To have
okay
a
with that?
development come in and it be evaluated against two segments? I think in any case, they would have to be somewhat cohesive with one another, just because they're right beside each other along a pathway. So there is some amount of cohesion that I would anticipate, especially if they are both at a current point within the downtown Crozet district. Zoning wise.
Yeah, I think the only concern would be if you had a like I don't know if there are other, I think maybe the segment of 29 that I had looked at an Airport Road where you could potentially have a development with two entrances. I
The
guess,
Sheets project.
yeah, the only thing would be, I can't imagine. I don't think it would be that much of an issue if we evaluated them according to separate criteria. There are still requirements that a single development have some level of sort of coherence, right? So it's okay if we evaluate the Crozet Avenue side along Crozet Avenue contextual considerations and the railroad segment along railroad contextual considerations. And the applicant's job would be to figure out how to make that all work as one application. So maybe that's okay.
Agreed.
Talking
I
myself
agree,
through it.
Yeah, because I think the segments, I think this is more of a resource than a set of hard and fast rules. So I think as a resource, you can draw from from either one. As long as the design itself is cohesive and makes sense.
So this work that we're doing now is one of the important things that will come out of it is we'll know better what needs to change in the actual guidelines. So with that in mind, we might want to be a little more specific somewhere when we're talking about the railroad segment. Maybe we need to get a little more specific wording in there as to what's expected or what's anticipated or what's appropriate to be seen from the street looking in that direction.
Yeah, because I guess there's still, even if you were to treat the railroad, for instance, as the rear of that development, there would still be considerations around like, I don't know, mechanical equipment and all those sorts of stuff that regardless of whether or not it's against the railroad, you probably want to screen or do something to.
All right, any other comments or questions?
That was a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, at least from my perspective, it would be nice if we needed to put a finer point on what we were looking for, would be to emphasize that corridor landscape planting applied at both sides and was still important at the southern edge. I think because the rail topography kind of blocks the pedestrian zone of the buildings and development on the other side, that part of the overall guidelines likely might not be all that applicable, but the overall guidelines attention to material, scale, order would seem still to apply to the buildings that, at least for me, that are developed there. And that's one thing I think from the study of the 64 corridor in terms of an update to the guidelines, and one that would, I think, require interface possibly with planning and zoning and the supervisors, would be looking at whether we can increase the requirements for landscape buffers along some corridors to try and protect the overall rural character of the county in those zones that are not yet as intensively developed. I think the emphasis in this corridor and some of the text on preserving mountain views is good. I think as we're looking through the corridors, identifying areas where there are view sheds that might be compromised by future refrigerated building high rises or other things, may be something at least I would be interested in considering. I don't know whether others. And so toward that extent, I think the northern edge of this zone by the railroads, I don't know what the zoning is for this area too, but to the extent the buildings don't become too tall, then the mountainous backdrop of Crozet can remain. I think that's an important character defining feature.
Should I move on?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Oh, no, just let me know when.
Yeah. Yeah, does anyone have any questions or comments on this segment? Or Mariah, did you want to go through this one?
Sure. So this segment is characterized mostly by wooded borders. It has a lot of residential development on it, and the road tends to go with the topography. So you kind of see these kind of distant views, but also wooded. It's really characterized by its topography. There aren't many developments on here that would be reviewed currently by the ARB because they are residential in nature. So a lot of the pictures at the bottom you'll see have that. You don't really see a whole lot of buildings in them. It starts off with buildings that are more historic in style, but they have a deep setback from the road.
This might have been the vet building Wasn't there expansion on, or one of these,
Can't recall
Sites.
exactly where it was. No.
but it was set pretty far back. I think they
Yeah.
did
I
an
think it was
addition
along
and there
that
was some
section.
parking, but it's set back and kind of down. And that's closer into town, and then you get past that, it's pretty residential.
Yeah, so I think that was one of the things that I think is of interest to me in terms of any future update would be to what extent in residential areas, we could make at least some corridor landscape guidelines applicable to residential development, because I don't believe they are currently. For the most part, a lot of it's been very well screened, but there are sporadic instances where it's coming very close to the corridor and there's no real buffer to it. And so that might be another area that it would be helpful to.
Is it only applicable when we see like a multifamily or like a townhome?
Right.
Development, but if it was a single family or
Single family attached.
So to Dave's question or point, if it's single family detached, there's not even a land, we can't even impose a landscape buffer provision. Like there's no, we have no purview.
Right.
And that's,
we see like monument signs, like a neighborhood sign, or is that also exempt? Like at an entrance? To a
That's a good,
neighborhood.
that is a good question. A freestanding sign would require a permit and we would see those.
Okay.
And is there any avenue, what would the legislative avenue or the update be required to create any purview for the corridor guidelines to apply to single family adjacent to the corridor?
Well, it would be a change to the ordinance, a zoning text amendment, but I think probably the route that makes more sense is to when we
Yeah, the
when we
scenic
get back
highway.
to considering the back to the arterial issue and the corridors that were not arterials and thinking about when we have the final list of those that that wouldn't be arterials, what other options would we be looking at? Possibly historic districts, possibly scenic highway. I think some of those other options are probably better suited to address that
Okay,
issue. And that's
Great.
probably what we'll want to think about at that time.
Okay. Thank you, Margaret.
and I guess I have a question about that, the single family detached development being outside of the ARB's typical review. I guess I just wonder if that creates an incentive towards single family detached development where someone would propose where there might be situations where a townhome or a multifamily development would be more appropriate and could provide additional screening or whatever, or be more desirable addition to the corridors. If the opportunity to evade that level of scrutiny or review is like a deciding point for anyone searching to do a project, or if it's just like we do single family homes and that's our thing and they never really think about the ARB and it's not a big deal. I guess I'm wondering if that's something that would make sense to look at, or whether, it makes sense to do it the way we've been doing it.
Yeah, others might be better able to answer that question. My guess is that if a developer is deciding between single family detached and some other product, it's not whether they have to go to the ARB or not.
Yeah. And it's not like the single family home builders are necessarily the same people who are building townhouses and multifamily developments, right? Or,
Not necessarily. I think the zoning is more what's going to dictate. Because the zoning will help dictate price. And if somebody's paying for multifamily, they're not building single family because those numbers don't work.
okay,
Maybe townhouse, you could argue, but I think, yeah, typically their developers are going to seek to maximize their density. The ARB screening guidelines is probably not a significant factor.
okay.
Would be mine. That's that, you guys.
I agree. We're pretty important, but we're not that important.
Yeah.
Just kidding. Strike that from the record.
Right.
Yeah, I think single family is just would be an existing, R1 lot that either has a house or, could be a house, but if it's anything other than just a single residence, I think it might have to come before the ARB if it's any kind of multifamily, so.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it's, outside of the developed, kind of urban ring, you're not gonna have much or any multifamily. Right? Isn't that in the rural lands, it would all be single family?
I think there's some. Well, now I'm thinking about it. Maybe that's it.
I'm not quite sure where the development area begins and ends in this, along this corridor. It might be fully contained within the corridor. I need to look that up, but based on the development pattern, it's around some very large developments, so I don't think it's safe to say that this is cordoned off from more dense residential development in the future, especially with its proximity to downtown. There's Old Trail below it, there's Glenbrook above it. Both of those are very significant developments.
Yeah, I guess if I was thinking about if we're adding this requirement along corridors, like you mentioned, that would be maybe scenic byways or highways that I don't think the zoning in any of those instances would allow for I think we're dealing with single family detached in most instances. Am I not reading that correctly?
Yeah, so if it's just a single parcel and it's not somebody developing multiple parcels, all as detached residences. Yeah, I'm not sure. We'd have to, I don't know exactly how it would work. It's just, we'd have to look at that and see what might be possible.
Right, it looks like in the Crozet master plan, it looks like the DCD ends at Tabor on the east side, but it extends further south on the west side to I don't know whether that would impact the termination location for that downtown district. Could be impacted by that.
It could be. I think it would be along corridors. I think in urban design, it's nice to have a similar context on both sides of the street. So if you have an active place, it's active on both sides. And if you have a passive place, it's passive on both sides. So they reinforce each other in terms of activity and also a stopping point. Because like in a very downtown feel and segment, you want that to ideally be about 1/3 of a mile long, I think is best practice. So I don't know that you would really want that kind of activity, is particularly that's appropriate in a downtown, to extend only on one side of the street longer than it wants to. You almost want to build that density of high volume activity in a center place. So if Tabor Street is where that district ends on both sides of the street, then I think that's appropriate as an ending point. But if you don't think so, that's something to talk about.
I think it raises an additional question about why the DCD was extended south on the left side, but not on the right, to your point. It seems like you'd want it to be the same on both sides.
And I'm not sure why. That
Eric,
predates
do you have any
me.
recollection as to why that ended up
Yeah,
that way?
we can ask other staff who might
Okay.
have been working on that, might remember.
All right, any additional questions or comments?
Brownsville is the last segment along this corridor and it ends at Route 250.
Similar question here. Because two corridors with different, somewhat different characters intersect at 250. We take the storage facility that we reviewed recently. Would guidelines be different on Crozet Avenue than they are on 250? And I think we did treat them somewhat differently because we imposed a buffer on the 240 side that we didn't require.
That's a good question. We may maybe have a separate, once we get through these, maybe we have a separate little session on the corridors that come together and just see if we're being consistent how we treat the intersections.
And then I think I wonder if this one might be joined to the segment we were just looking at previously as one with, different terminus.
Combine this.
Combine this and the one we were just discussing, the rolling residential, I think.
And isn't that corner parcel the only thing that's zoned differently?
It is, so it's a spot zone kind of.
When you're driving it, it does seem kind of continuous with that previous segment, at least in my mind.
I
It could
agree.
kind of go both ways. The structures are kind of different. They have a different relationship to the street. Some of them are subdivision focused and they have internal streets. They also have kind of the ones in this segment are newer in nature, so they are larger lot coverage of the buildings. There's not as much landscaping, not as much of a wooded buffer. And the structures in general are a lot more visible in this segment. And the views that you get driving in the northern direction are more of the mountains, which is, and then in the segment just north of it, the views are more of a rolling landscape and less distant in nature. But that might not be coming out in the segment sheets right now, that differentiation. So I think when it comes to evaluation, there's a question as to whether it would come in front of the ARB, but the structures and sizes are different and the views to maintain are different.
Yeah, I guess this is one of those tricky questions of like, to what extent this project documents and reflects the existing built fabric of what's along the corridor, and to what extent it's like which segment should be treated similarly as a matter of policy, because it does feel kind of like I kind of can both see the idea that they feel similar when you're driving these segments, and just that, and it kind of raises the question of if you were looking at a development at the segment we just reviewed, would the development that happens in this segment be an appropriate contextual reference to be applying to that other situation, or does it make sense that they would be treated separately? Because that's I feel like that's kind of the central question, right? Is like, if we treated them as one segment, then this is an appropriate reference for what the context is. And if you break it up, it's not.
Good way to think about it. I'm fine if we combine them.
Yeah, I am too.
Well, and a similar development wouldn't be under our purview anyway, right?
That's
So-
right, yeah. And any future residential development here is likely to be single family detached, so
Mhm.
we're not gonna review it anyway.
I guess the only situation would be if someone were in some hypothetical place where the market works out that way, that someone would look at building townhouses and refer to the massing and scale of these buildings, but I don't know. I don't think that's a huge deal.
I think we'll need to add like an introductory page that talks about sort of, how we're talking about all this and, the stuff that predates the entrance corridor and what's there right now and what's coming in the future and how all that, what it all means. There'll be some careful wording there.
Any additional comments or questions? Guess if not, we can go on.
Okay, the next, are we ready? Sorry, okay. Just realized that I might not have read your cue right. Okay, so the last segment today is Fontaine, or the last corridor is Fontaine. This we viewed as a single segment and a single spread. So graphically, the map has the same uses the same graphic language and layout as the other corridor sheets where it's a finite end to end and then highlights what is along it to be reviewed. There's a portion of this segment that's inside the Charlottesville boundary. We don't control that. So we kind of viewed it as what would Albemarle County be fine with, and it's in what it is authorized to control. Most of the developments along this segment are owned by the university. They have deep setbacks, very mature landscaped buffers with larger trees. The Ravenna Trail is in this area as well, but we focused on the landscaping as the biggest portion. There is some peek throughs of development, but for the most part, everything is screened, and parking lot areas that are very large are not visible from the corridor.
I think here we can just ask Frank and Fred to keep up the good work.
No.
No comment.
Is the Route 29 bypass on our list of entrance corridors or no? It is. Could we go back to the previous slide too? I guess one to add things to Mariah's graphics plate is if there are corridors that are shown in other maps, I think it would be helpful to know, just like on this one, if to indicate in maybe like a dash or a halftone or something that 250 is a corridor, just so that we know. Because I can imagine a similar situation when we're talking about all of these intersecting corridors. If we're thinking about that Fontaine property from the 29 bypass side versus the Fontaine side, it's just helpful to know what's
Yeah,
applying.
All the property on the north side zoned R1.
Is it? I
I
don't recall.
I sort of gathered that from the summary, the last sentence in the characteristics. Owned by the university?
The east end is,
So O Hill is all, that's all UVA, right? And everything around it's UVA.
I guess this is kind of where I get a little bit maybe confused or just because in my mind, knowing that the Fontaine Research Park is slated for redevelopment, I don't necessarily have any opinions right now about whether it needs to retain the character of being a research park, you know? So I don't know that there's a way to address that with this type of study necessarily, but I don't know, I guess I would just raise a thought that I'm open to possibilities here and other places, but I don't know how that gets addressed in the context of the study, and maybe it doesn't.
It might turn to a deeper look at what are the characteristics to avoid, like what would incompatibility look like, more than when is it appropriate to break compatibility. But what are the things that need to stay constant through time?
So it looks like the zoning on the north side is primarily R1. There's a little piece of R2.
The university as a state entity is exempt from this board's review. Does that apply as well to the real estate foundation? Because I think the other thing for some of these corridors, I mean, obviously the ownership could change, but it seems unlikely. Maybe acknowledging those corridors where we effectively don't have jurisdiction because the development is outside of the counties.
The buildings in the research park were
Okay.
reviewed by the ARB.
Okay,
So,
excellent.
well, the ones that were expected to be visible.
Okay, excellent.
Is Fontaine on the city side a BAR controlled?
That I don't know.
I don't know.
Or do you know if the Fontaine on the city side is subject to BAR review?
That is a good question.
Might be an entrance corridor in the city. which used to just be
Yeah.
like Planning commission.
Yeah.
But they were talking about actually changing that, so ARB reviewed entrance corridor in the city, or BAR, excuse me. I don't know if that's happened or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But we've got the zoning up.
So all those properties, 76, 4, 5, 8, 7, those are all owned by UBA.
76.8 is 5, 4, 9.
I mean, it's kind of an interesting situation where like the whole corridor could be, in theory, set by the university, that there's,
Yeah.
you know, it's not like it would be like, oh, this lower part has to be compatible with the R1 neighborhood across the street. It's like it can all be compatible with itself because it'll all just be its own thing.
A lot of time.
Yeah.
All right, well, any more comments or questions?
No.
And I guess as with all the previous drafts, would just like to say thank you to Mariah and Margaret for
Yeah.
the work. It's really wonderful and really appreciate what you're putting together, the questions you're raising for the board and the process. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We did have one other.
When I plugged the computer back in, it didn't seem to go. Just a last comment on this, maybe since there wasn't kind of a finite feeling either way as to how the corridor might develop in the future, might this be an area where we just peel back a lot of the information contained and just focus on the characteristics to avoid instead of noting what is currently there, since it's all under the control of one pretty sizable landowner? You know, maybe it doesn't need structures and at all, if the board feels like a lot could be compatible in this area and would naturally be compatible with itself. Or we can keep it just options.
I think it'd probably make sense to keep it without respect for who owns the land or what the status is. But I think if a project were coming through the ARB, we would certainly consider it.
Okay. So that's the end of the segments and corridors that we have for you today. We just wanted to go through the next round of corridor assignments. This is what has been this is what's been assigned to date and the dates attached to them.
All right, well, I know I'm a little bit late with mine. But does anybody have any adjustments or anything that they otherwise?
6 is right around the corner.
You did.
Hard to believe.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll be able to finish my airport road segment for the 26th.
That's okay. So the dates that we projected for you all to have your surveys completed, if you look at the column that's furthest to the right, you know, there's that's just to give us time to get through them all. So we won't, you know, process them immediately. So if some of you take longer than others, you know, it'll still work.
Something should be done soon.
Yeah, but somebody has to come first.
Somebody
Yeah.
does need to get something done.
The coordinator must,
Somebody needs to do something.
someone needs to be on time.
Right.
Okay.
But I do have a question about the maps. As you were doing your survey, were those maps helpful? Were they not helpful? Would they be helpful to do again?
I found the map very helpful.
Very helpful.
Me too.
Yeah.
I'm sure I will find it very helpful.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all. That's all we have for today.
All right, well, thank you very much. Guess we'll move to other business. Approval of the September 6th, 2022 minutes. Would anybody like to make a motion to approve?
I'll move for approval.
Can I get a
Go
second?
ahead. No, please.
You were on a roll.
I'll second.
All right, Carolyn, could we do a vote?
Sure. Mr. Stoner,
Aye.
Mr. Hancock,
Aye.
Mr. Matsuno,
Aye.
Mr. Henningsen,
Aye.
Mr. Vanderwerf.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And the next ARB meeting is scheduled for October 3rd, 2022. This will be an in-person meeting. Is there anyone who does not think they will be able to make it to that?
I am unsure, but there's a chance. I'll follow up with you and Margaret and let you know.
All right, sounds like we will have a quorum. Does anyone have any other business or items they'd like to discuss?
I do have one thing. I'm having trouble hearing most of you.
Yeah.
So I think if everyone can try and bring their mics
Lena.
closer, and Dave, not to pick on you, but I'm wondering if maybe we could switch you and Taro, and so that you're not having to move back and forth.
Okay.
when
Or I
you-
could go further down the row if that works. It might be that we start at the chair and I just head down there.
That would work too. Is
Okay.
that-
Yeah,
okay?
Is it possible to turn these up? Because I find it hard to hear everyone.
I can hear everybody fine through the Zoom meeting.
However, what makes it difficult is all of them are on the same channel. So if I turn that arrow, that also,
Turns up everybody's.
so if there's a different volume, it can be, that issue. Really what needs to happen is there needs to be an installation of speakers in the lane. Ultimately not being able to reach each other and not your guys' fault structure in here. That is something that I'm working with FES on, but in the meantime, yes, I would recommend getting really close and comfortable with your microphones.
All right, thank you so much.
Can we pin them to our lapels?
Test, one, test.
Yeah, maybe we could. Could I mention one item, I guess not to put your Frank's stuff into the business of the meeting, but Frank, you had reached out to us on some board representation at the,
Oh, yes. So Dave Benish. Oh, somebody turn the mics up. That somebody turn the mics up already? Oh, okay.
right.
Yeah, no, that's big difference. Okay.
okay,
Dave Benish had reached out to me about attending Places 29 resident planning. I thought I was going to be able to attend. It turns out I'm going to be out of town. It sounds like Tara can attend.
So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
I think David was gonna contact the chairperson for that CAC today. Our recommendation is that we wait until November and do it at that time. So
Okay.
we'll figure out what that date is going to be and then see who can attend at that time.
Okay.
I appreciate that. I'm just afraid that there would be questions that Taro, you wouldn't be able to answer since you're relatively new.
that was my concern also. I could physically be there, but I would have preferred someone with more tenure on the board be that representative, so I wanted to raise it. But if it's moved to November, then maybe someone else can be the person to do that.
Could be beneficial.
Well,
I don't know.
I would want to miss.
Wish I could help you.
We don't necessarily need to limit it to one person. 2 ARB members could attend. We wouldn't want to do 3 because then it's a meeting of the ARB, but if 2 people are interested in doing it, we could do that. as
What
well.
are the issues? Do you like, for what purpose would ARB members, as opposed to just you and Mariah, for example, being there?
I believe the some CAC members want to hear directly from ARB members how applications are considered and reviewed and approved.
Okay.
And we will try to get specific questions ahead of time.
All right. Does anyone have anything else?
No.
All right. This meeting is adjourned to the next meeting on October 3rd. It is 2:07 by my watch.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.